Did you see that? Did...
The wilderness holds more than wind and trees. Far from cities, strange things sometimes happen in quiet forests and snowy slopes. Shadows move where no one stands, and heavy footprints appear without a sound. From a ranger outpost in Montana torn apart overnight to two seasoned mountaineers in the Pyrenees who vanished into the fog, in this video we'll explore 6 chilling encounters that left survivors haunted and investigators without answers. On August 1, 2025, a small ranger outpost sat deep in Montana's backcountry, miles from the nearest town. It was a simple wooden structure with a single main room, a loft above for sleeping, and a tool shed attached at the side. The station was manned by a small team who rotated shifts to monitor fire risks and track wildlife activity in the surrounding wilderness. Among them was a veteran named Alan Pierce, a man in his 50s who had spent decades working in remote parks. His calm nature and sharp eye for weather changes had saved hikers and campers on more than one occasion. That night, however, he was not on duty. He had stayed in the loft to rest before his next rotation. The day before had been quiet. The air was warm but heavy, and a stillness hung over the forest. Most of the crew had finished their rounds and headed down the trail toward a nearby camp. Alan remained alone in the station, the building creaking softly under the weight of the summer heat. By midnight, the forest outside was silent, without even the chirp of crickets. The moon hung pale above the tall pines, casting faint silver lines across the clearing. Sometime in the dark hours, a faint tremor passed through the wooden floor. At first it was subtle, like distant thunder. Then the sound grew, a steady, deliberate thudding that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Each impact was spaced evenly, the rhythm too slow for running animals, too heavy for human steps. Alan stirred in his bed but stayed still, listening. The sound drew closer, each step making the walls groan faintly. Without warning, a sharp crack split the silence as the front door was torn from its frame. Wood splinters scattered across the floor. The heavy slab of pine crashed to the ground outside. Support beams along the front wall shuddered, one splintering down the center. Something immense moved inside, its weight making the floorboards bend under each step. A shadow passed across the loft's single window, blocking out the moonlight entirely. Furniture was thrown as if weightless. A desk slid across the room and toppled against the far wall. Metal chairs clanged as they struck the floor. A large storage chest was hurled so hard it wedged into the doorway of the tool shed. Radios and maps scattered across the ground, some vanishing entirely from sight. Above the noise of breaking wood and scraping metal came a deep, controlled breathing that filled the room, its sound vibrating in Alan's chest. For a long moment, the shadow lingered near the window, the faint moonlight tracing the edge of a massive form. High above the wall, deep gouges appeared in the siding, long, uneven cuts as though something had dragged claws or rough hands along the wood. Then, as suddenly as it began, the steps turned away. The sounds receded into the forest, each thud fainter than the last, leaving only the wreckage and a heavy, unnatural stillness inside the station. Alan remained still for several minutes, his breathing shallow as the quiet settled over the wrecked station. The air felt thick and stale, heavy with the scent of splintered wood and something earthy that clung to the walls. From above in the loft, he could see the overturned furniture below, the scattered supplies, and the yawning gap where the front door had been. A faint draft moved through the room, carrying the cold bite of the forest night. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked sharply, then silence returned. When he finally climbed down, his legs trembled. He stepped carefully over broken boards and shattered glass, each sound unnaturally loud in the emptiness. Tools that had been kept in the shed were missing, leaving only hooks swinging gently on the wall. One radio lay crushed under a table, its casing cracked, the antenna bent. Another was gone entirely. Outside, faint light from the moon revealed shapes caught high among the surrounding pines. A wrench hung from a branch nearly 20 feet above the ground. A folded map flapped faintly in the wind where it had been wedged between two limbs. Alan walked the perimeter, scanning the ground. The soil in front of the station held wide impressions pressed deep into the dirt. They were spaced far apart, their edges clean and sharp despite the dry earth. Each print looked as though it belonged to something far heavier than any known animal, the size almost doubling that of a man's stride. The trail moved around the building, pausing at the corners, then disappeared into the thick trees without a broken twig or shifted stone to mark the way. He felt the weight of the forest pressing in, the silence broken only by his own footsteps. The station, usually a place of safety, now felt exposed and fragile, its walls offering no real barrier. The gouges carved into the siding caught his attention again. They were set far higher than his reach, the edges splintered fresh, the marks uneven but deliberate. The wood seemed torn rather than cut, as though gripped by immense strength. When the morning shift arrived hours later, the sun barely touched the clearing. The damage stood out stark against the pale light. They took in the scene quickly, the shattered beams, the missing supplies, and the strange placement of the items in the treetops. No animal tracks could be found apart from the enormous impressions near the entrance. Even the most experienced among them could not place their origin. By midday, word had spread to nearby outposts. No one volunteered to remain in the damaged building. The decision was made to close the station entirely until repairs could be made, but the conversation carried an unspoken agreement that no one wanted to return at all. Alan gathered his few belongings, moving slowly as if each step might stir something unseen. Within days, the building stood empty. Wind moved through the open doorway, carrying the smell of pine and damp soil into the hollow space. The forest reclaimed its stillness, but the gouges in the siding remained, catching the light at certain angles, as if marking the place where something had once stood watching. Those who passed the site in the weeks that followed noticed the same uneasy quiet, a silence that seemed to listen, as though the shadow that had come in the night might one day return. On February 9, 2024, two experienced mountaineers began their climb into the upper ridges of the Pyrenees. Marco Ruiz, 41, had spent decades scaling peaks across Europe, known among his peers for steady nerves and precision in dangerous conditions. His climbing partner, Daniel Moreau, was 38, an alpine guide from southern France who had led groups through narrow passes and icy ledges most would avoid. They met years earlier on a training course, and had since formed a habit of attempting difficult routes together during the winter season. That morning, the air was cold enough to crust the snow with a thin, glittering shell. Heavy fog clung low on the mountain, curling around jagged outcroppings and making distance difficult to judge. The pair moved slowly, speaking rarely over the radio to confirm progress. The climb was steady until the fog began to thicken, swallowing the horizon until even the slope ahead seemed to fade into pale white. By mid-morning, their voices carried through a rescue channel. Breathless and clipped, they reported that something was keeping pace with them in the mist. They did not name it or describe a shape, only that it was there. The tone was tight, as though each word was measured against the sound of their own footsteps. Static broke the signal, and the connection ended without warning. Hours later, a rescue team assembled at the base and began the ascent. The fog did not lift. Every step felt watched, though no one could agree on a source. By the time they reached the summit ridge, the wind had slowed to an unnatural stillness. Snow crunched under their boots as they stepped into a small clearing. The scene was unsettling in its order. Packs, ropes, and helmets were arranged neatly on the ground, as though placed there with care. Nothing was scattered, nothing buried in snow. A single climbing rope hung over the lip of a nearby crevasse, its frayed ends swaying slightly above the dark drop below. The wear on the rope did not match the clean cuts of a blade or the jagged tearing of rock. It looked pulled apart strand by strand. As they searched the ridge, the rescuers noticed the boulders. Massive stones, far too heavy for a person to move alone, had been stacked into uneven towers. They were not fixed to the ground, yet they balanced precariously, rocking with the faintest push of the wind. The stacks followed no path, some standing close to the trail, others further toward the drop. The air was unnervingly silent. No bird calls, no crack of settling ice, only the low hiss of wind moving through the fog. Several in the team admitted later to feeling a steady weight between their shoulder blades, as though something stood behind them just out of sight. The sensation did not fade even as they began their descent. The fog clung to the group like a wall, moving when they moved, never allowing the horizon to clear. The rescue team kept moving down the slope, but the sense of being followed grew heavier with every step. The mist pressed close, curling around their legs and filling the air with a damp chill. Boots crunched over the snow in a slow rhythm, yet every pause brought another sound, a faint shift, like weight settling on frozen ground, always just beyond the edge of vision. No one spoke. The mountain seemed to swallow even the smallest noise. Halfway through the descent, one of the climbers in the group spotted another stack of stones. This one was taller than a man. The largest boulder balanced on a narrow point. It rocked gently, though no wind moved across the slope. The snow around its base was disturbed in a wide circle, as if something massive had paced there for a long time. The prints, if they were prints, were too warped by melting to show a clear shape, but the depth suggested a weight no person could match. Farther down, a length of rope lay across the trail. It was stretched tight between two rocks. The ends knotted in a way none of the team recognized. One end was dusted with ice, the other wet as though it had just been pulled from water. Beyond it, the fog seemed thicker, hiding the slope below in a shifting wall of white. The rescuers stepped carefully over it, but the feeling of unseen eyes only deepened. As the group neared the tree line, the mist seemed to follow, spilling between dark trunks and clinging low over the snow. The silence there was sharper, cutting off even the faint hiss of wind. The lead rescuer caught sight of something caught in a branch, a strip of fabric, thin and pale, frozen stiff. It was looped high above the ground, far beyond the reach of any person standing below. The bark beneath it was worn smooth, like something had brushed against it many times. When they finally reached the base, the air felt lighter, but none of them looked back toward the ridge. The gear left at the summit was recovered later by another team, yet nothing about its arrangement had changed. The rope at the crevasse remained frayed, and the stone tower still swayed in the same measured way. Officials listed the disappearance as the result of bad weather and poor visibility, marking exhaustion and disorientation as likely causes. The details about the stacked stones, the high strip of fabric, and the strange frayed rope were left out of reports. Families were told the mountain kept its own dangers, and no more search efforts were planned. Weeks later, other climbers reported strange stillness on the same ridge. Some spoke of boulders arranged in new shapes overnight. Others claimed to feel a presence in the fog, pacing just out of view. Few stayed long after dark. The trail grew quieter that season, and by winter's end the ridge had been left to the mist and whatever moved within it. On July 19, 2024, a family from a small Siberian village set out on a summer trip deep into the taiga. The father, Pavel, had worked for years as a forestry guide and knew the remote trails well. His wife, Irina, was a schoolteacher who loved the outdoors and often joined him on long camping trips. Their children, 12-year-old Yulia and 9-year-old Anton, had grown up exploring the forests near home, chasing each other between trees and learning to spot tracks in the mud. Even the family's loyal dog, a mixed breed named Sharik, came along on nearly every journey. This trip was meant to be peaceful. Days of fishing, gathering berries, and resting under the endless summer sky. They hiked for hours that first day, following winding paths between towering conifers. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp moss. Pavel chose a clearing beside a small stream, far from any marked trail. The site was quiet, the ground soft enough for tents, and the trees offered thick cover from wind. Irina unpacked supplies while the children gathered fallen branches for a fire. The evening passed calmly, with the sound of running water mixing with the distant calls of birds. By the second night, the forest felt different. The usual hum of insects seemed muted, and every now and then, A faint, heavy snap echoed from somewhere far beyond the tree line. Sharik's ears twitched at each sound, and he paced near the tents, low to the ground. A faint, deep roar rolled across the forest once, so low it seemed to vibrate through the ground rather than the air. It faded quickly but left an uneasy stillness in its wake. Sometime in the hours before dawn, movement stirred around the camp. The first noise was the sharp rip of fabric, followed by the thud of something heavy pressing into soft earth. The tents shifted, their walls pulling inward slightly before tearing open in long, jagged lines. Supplies clattered to the ground, pots, clothing, food, scattering across the clearing. A rush of air seemed to pass through the camp, bringing with it the smell of wet soil and something faintly metallic. Sharik bolted toward the trees but stopped short, crawling beneath a fallen log and refusing to come out. The fire, left to burn low in the night, was untouched, yet beside it, backpacks, shoes, and even one of Anton's small toys had been stacked in a strange, neat pile against a nearby trunk. The impressions in the earth around the camp were unlike anything the family had seen before, broad, deep, and spaced far apart, each one shaped like a bare foot but far larger than any human could make. They trailed from the torn tents toward the dense forest, fading into nothing after only a short distance. The forest closed in with silence. When the rangers later arrived, the camp was frozen in that state. Ripped shelters, scattered belongings, and 4 still forms lying as if they had fallen all at once, their eyes fixed wide on the canopy above. The trees around them stood undisturbed, but the air carried the faint echo of something that had passed through in the night. The scene was silent when the search team began their work. The air was heavy, carrying no sound of birds or moving leaves. The first ranger stepped carefully around the edge of the clearing, eyes tracing the strange shapes in the soil. Each print looked pressed with deliberate weight, the edges crisp despite the soft ground. The spacing between them was far wider than a normal stride, and none showed any sign of dragging or slipping. They ended in the same way as described by locals before, abruptly, as though the maker had lifted away from the earth itself. The bodies were found lying close to the torn shelters, their positions unnatural, as if they had been placed with care rather than falling where they stood. There were no bruises, no cuts, no marks that could explain how life had left them. The skin was pale, the eyes wide, and the fingers slightly curled. Even the clothing was undamaged except for small patches of dirt, as if they had been set down rather than pulled or struck. The rangers noted that nothing seemed taken except for the order of things. Supplies stacked neatly, gear arranged in lines, and food packets unopened. Sharik was discovered under the fallen log, trembling violently. His fur was damp from the ground, and his breathing came in quick bursts. Even when coaxed with water, he refused to step toward the camp, choosing instead to keep his body pressed low, eyes fixed on the tree line. He stayed that way until the team lifted him out and carried him away. Near the stream, a single branch had been stripped of bark high above human reach. The pale wood beneath looked fresh, with small splinters scattered below. Farther out, between 2 large trunks, a patch of moss was flattened in an oval shape, the edges pressed deep into the ground. No one could decide whether it was a resting place or simply where something large had stood for a long time. The team worked in silence, gathering what they could without disturbing more than necessary. Some spoke quietly among themselves, noting the absence of scavengers. In a forest like this, food left unattended was usually gone within hours, yet nothing had been touched. The cold could not explain it. Other parts of the taiga were alive with small tracks and foraging marks, but here, the ground remained empty except for the heavy impressions and the ordered piles of belongings. The official report marked the cause as unknown, leaning toward animal attack. Yet the words in the file avoided certain details. The neat stacks, the lack of damage to the bodies, and the prints that ended mid-step. Back in the village, the story spread quickly. Some claimed the family had crossed paths with something that did not hunt for food but for presence, a force that moved through the forest to remind people it was still there. The clearing was left untouched after the recovery, the torn shelters collapsing under the weight of snow that winter. When spring came, new growth filled the taiga, but the ground where the strange impressions had been stayed bare. Sharik never returned to the woods, even when walked on a leash. His eyes would fix on the same dark stretch of trees, ears low, until the path turned away. Those who passed near the clearing spoke of an uneasy stillness, a feeling that the forest watched from just beyond sight. None stayed long enough to see if anything moved between the shadows. On October 9, 2024, a long freight train moved steadily through the remote wilderness of northern Montana. The engineer, Harold Weller, had worked on the rails for over 30 years, running routes through mountains, forests, and open plains. His calm manner and quick decisions had carried him safely through rock slides, storms, and sudden animal crossings. In the cab beside him was Colin Price, a younger conductor who had been with the company for only 4 years, but had already built a reputation for his sharp attention and steady nerves during night runs. That evening, their train was hauling heavy cargo across one of the most isolated stretches of track in the state. The route cut between tall pines on both sides, the land sloping steeply toward shadowed valleys. The night was clear but moonless, and the headlamps carved narrow beams ahead into the darkness. The steel wheels hummed in a constant rhythm, the sound carrying far into the still air. Fog gathered low between the trees, drifting in slow curls across the gravel beside the rails. The forest seemed silent except for the pounding of the train. No distant howls, no rustle of movement in the undergrowth, only the steady push of the engine through the cold night. Harold kept his eyes on the tracks when something immense took shape ahead. It was not a boulder, nor the curved back of a fallen tree. The outline was upright, broad and unmoving. In seconds, his instincts took over, and he slammed the emergency brake. The screech of metal filled the air as sparks burst along the wheels. The cargo cars shuddered and swayed under the strain. The train struck with a sound that shook the valley, a deep, crushing impact followed by the sharp crack of twisting steel. The cab jolted violently and the glass rattled in its frame. Colin braced against the wall, his eyes locked forward just in time to see a massive, dark form lurch sideways into the swirling fog. For a heartbeat, the lights caught the edge of what looked like matted hair along a towering shoulder before it vanished into the pines. The cars finally ground to a halt along a warped section of track. Steam hissed from the brakes, curling upward into the still air. Harold and Colin stayed in the cab, scanning the tree line. The forest gave nothing back. No sound, no movement. The heavy smell of damp earth and metal filled the cab as the two men sat in silence. The twisted rails ahead gleamed in the light, deep gouges carved into the steel as though something had been dragged across them. Gravel was scattered far from the tracks, and a long scar ran through the wooden ties beneath. The fog thickened quickly, swallowing the edges of the light. The stillness beyond the broken stretch felt absolute, as if even the trees were holding back. Neither man stepped outside. Somewhere past the reach of the lamps, the forest waited, unmoving, the night holding on to whatever had crossed the tracks. Harold kept the engine idle until the first trace of light touched the fog. Dawn came slow in the deep wilderness, its pale glow spilling between the pine trunks in thin strips. When they finally stepped from the cab, the air was colder than before, carrying the heavy scent of wet bark. The ground beside the rails was torn in places, long channels dug into the gravel as if by something immense dragging its weight. The steel itself was bent outward in one spot. The edges rippled like soft clay forced into a curve. Colin moved toward the mark where the headlamp beam had caught the shadow the night before. There, in the damp earth beyond the ballast, lay impressions unlike anything he had seen. They were broad and rounded at the front, with a span that dwarfed the length of his boot. The depth of each suggested a mass beyond that of any animal common to the region. The stride between them was so great that he had to take several steps to match the distance. The tracks led toward the densest part of the forest, then ended sharply in a patch of untouched needles and moss. Higher up, several branches had been stripped of bark, the raw wood pale against the dark trunks. Some were set at a height no human could reach without equipment. On one trunk, deep vertical gouges ran in parallel lines. The wood splintered and curled outward, as if torn by force rather than cut. Bits of damp moss clung to the splinters, swaying slightly in the light breeze that had begun to stir. The surrounding silence pressed in again, thicker now that the engine's noise was gone. Even in the early morning, there was no sign of birds or insects. The forest seemed to absorb the sound of their movements, leaving each footstep muted. The fog had sunk lower, pooling in hollows between the roots and around the base of boulders. It shifted when they walked, curling toward the trees as if drawn away. The repair team arrived hours later, their trucks moving slowly along the service road. They worked in careful silence, replacing damaged rails and resetting ties. One worker paused to glance at the gouges in the steel, tracing them with a gloved hand before stepping away without comment. Another found that several bolts securing the joint bars were missing entirely, as though torn out rather than loosened. None of the crew ventured far from the tracks. By midday, the line was clear again, but the forest remained still. The two men boarded the cab for the slow return to the nearest yard. Neither looked toward the tree line as they passed the spot where the tracks had ended. In the days that followed, the story moved quietly among rail workers. Some avoided night runs through that section, trading shifts or requesting alternate routes. Locals near the service road spoke of hearing dull, heavy impacts echoing from the valley on cold nights, followed by long periods of silence. The damaged rails were replaced, the bent sections hauled away, but the impressions beside the track faded slowly in the damp soil. Weeks later, a thin mist lingered along that same stretch, even on clear mornings. Those who passed claimed it felt as if something watched from deep within the trees, waiting for the sound of steel and wheels to return. On February 9th, 2025, three longtime friends set out from a small ski lodge tucked high in the Colorado Rockies, eager for a full day in the backcountry. Ethan Ward, the most skilled skier of the group, had years of experience navigating ungroomed slopes and hidden routes far from the marked trails. Daniel Hayes, a mountain guide during the warmer months, was comfortable in rough terrain and confident in reading weather patterns. The third, Owen Price, was newer to deep wilderness skiing but strong and determined, trusting the others to keep them on safe lines. They carried lightweight packs with food, water, and extra layers, knowing the backcountry could turn dangerous without warning. The morning began under a pale blue sky. Light winds carried dry snow across the ridges, and the powder lay untouched, sparkling in the early sun. They followed a narrow path marked only by faint tracks from an earlier storm, pushing deeper into forested slopes where the sound of the lodge faded completely. Pine branches hung heavy with frost, and each turn carved clean arcs into the snow. For hours they skied in steady rhythm, weaving between trees and cutting across steep glades. By midday they had climbed higher, reaching a ridge that dropped sharply into a hidden valley below. From there the forest grew thicker, shadows stretching long across the snow. The air seemed stiller here, and the usual chatter of birds and wind faded into an odd hush. They pressed on, leaving the open slopes for a narrow chute that wound between frozen boulders. It was in that silent stretch that the first unsettling moment came. Ethan, leading the descent, slowed sharply. In the snow ahead, wide depressions broke the smooth surface. They were not shaped like ski tracks or snowshoe prints. Each one was long, deep, and uneven, as if something massive had stepped there, melting and compacting the powder under its weight. The gaps between them were too wide for any human stride. They moved cautiously past the marks, scanning the tree line. Owen lagged slightly behind, adjusting his pack straps. Daniel glanced over his shoulder just in time to catch a flicker of motion among the pines, a dark bulk shifting between trunks. The form was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the faint swaying of branches high above. A sudden gust swept through the chute, carrying loose snow that stung their faces. Ethan waved for the others to speed up, but the terrain forced them into a single file. The shadows ahead thickened as clouds rolled over the sun. Then came a muffled thump, snow sliding somewhere close, followed by the deep, rhythmic crunch of something moving parallel to them, hidden beyond the trees. Owen stumbled, his ski catching on buried debris. As he fell, a shape loomed against the dim light above, a towering outline blocking the pale sky. In the next instant, he was alone in the chute, his friends no longer in sight. Owen lay half-buried in cold powder, his breath fast and shallow. The chute around him was empty, the snow surface marked only by his fall and a scattering of heavy indentations leading away into the dark timber. The air was still, holding a weight that made every sound feel trapped. Far above, the ridge was hidden in mist that had rolled in quickly, swallowing the last view of the sky. Slowly, he pulled himself upright. His skis were still fixed, but the weight of the silence pressed harder than the snow. A few yards ahead, something caught his eye. Bright fabric swaying gently in the wind. His jacket and pack hung high in the branches of a pine, the straps twisted around a limb as though placed there with care. The sight made his chest tighten. No sign of how they had been lifted or by what strength. At the base of the tree, the snow was churned into deep, irregular shape. Each one sank far deeper than his boots could press. Even if he jumped, they pointed in no clear direction, instead circling in uneven loops that trailed into the forest's shadows. No drag mark, no sign of struggle. Just the heavy, deliberate impressions that seemed to mark a boundary he did not want to cross. Owen's mind felt slow, every movement cautious. The light continued to fade as if the day had shortened by hours and moments. He turned back toward the slope they had descended, but the chute now seemed steeper and longer, the route blurred by blowing snow. Somewhere distant, a low crunch echoed, like weight pressing into the ground, then lifting again. The silence was broken by a dull snap from deeper in the trees, followed by another, closer. His heart hammered as he edged backward, never turning his back to the shapes between the trunks. The pale snow in that direction shifted slightly, as though something vast had moved without sound. He forced himself to look away, fixing on the chute's narrow path. He stumbled down, legs heavy, every sense sharp for movement at the edges of sight. Once he thought he saw a dark bulk far behind him, framed between two trees, but when he blinked it was gone. The strange pressure in the air did not lift until the chute widened into a shallow basin. It was there that rescuers found him hours later, sprawled in a hollow dusted with frost, staring toward the tree line. His gear remained high in the pine above the chute, unreachable without climbing. The others were gone, their tracks ending near the deep loops in the snow. Days later, search teams scoured the area. They found no trace beyond those same broad impressions and the untouched arrangement of gear in the branches. Officials called it a weather accident, but the rescuers spoke quietly of the way the woods had felt, too still, as if the peaks themselves had been watching them leave. Owen never returned to the mountains. The memory of the shadow in the mist followed him everywhere. On February 16, 2025, Nathan Cole set out alone into the high country of the Rocky Mountains. At 32 years old, he was an experienced hiker who often spent entire weekends exploring trails far from any town. He preferred winter treks when the air was sharp and the land seemed untouched. His pack held a light tent, spare clothes, and enough food for 2 days. Nathan had always been careful, keeping to marked routes and checking weather reports before leaving. That morning was clear, with sunlight glinting off the snow-covered ridges. He parked his truck at a trailhead known for its narrow valleys and frozen streams. The path climbed steadily through thick pines before opening into a higher basin where a small creek ran under layers of ice. Nathan moved easily over the packed snow, his boots crunching in the stillness. There were no other footprints, no sign of wildlife beyond a few bird tracks near fallen branches. As the day passed, the sky grew pale and the air heavier. A light wind slid between the trees, carrying a faint smell of damp earth. Nathan crossed several frozen bends of the creek, noting how the snow there was undisturbed. He paused to drink, listening to the steady sound of water moving under the ice. Somewhere deep in the forest, a muffled thud echoed, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to be falling snow. He moved on, but the feeling of being watched settled over him. At first it was faint, just an awareness at the edge of thought. Then, as the shadows lengthened, it grew sharper, like weight pressing between his shoulders. Each time he glanced behind, the forest seemed still, but his steps began to quicken without him deciding. Near the edge of a narrow ravine, he noticed something strange. The snow around the trees bore wide, irregular impressions, each deeper than his boots could sink even when he jumped. They weren't in a trail but scattered, as if something had moved slowly in different directions before vanishing into the timber. Nathan crouched to look closer. The edges of the shapes were sharp, not softened by wind, and the depth suggested immense weight. A low, shifting shadow passed through the trees beyond the creek. It was taller than any man and moved without sound, the faint light breaking briefly across its shape before it melted into the gloom again. Nathan felt the cold press into him, as though the air itself had thickened. His chest tightened, and his hands began to tremble. He stepped back toward the ravine's edge, but the snow there gave way beneath him. In moments, icy water rushed around his legs, soaking his clothes through. The current was shallow but numbing. Above him, his pack and jacket were no longer on his shoulders. They now hung neatly over the branches of a pine just upstream, the straps twisted as though placed carefully. Nathan stared, too stunned to move, as the forest around him fell into an unnatural, suffocating silence. Nathan stood in the creek, the icy water pulling away what little warmth he had left. His legs felt heavy, the cold locking into his muscles. The branches above swayed slightly, though no wind moved through the basin. The jacket and pack dangled there, dripping slowly onto the snow below, as if they had been resting in that position for a long time. The arrangement was too neat to be an accident, each strap and fold placed with strange care. The forest pressed in on all sides. Every pine stood still, yet the silence felt like it was holding something inside it. Nathan tried to move toward the bank, but each step sent sharp pain through his legs. He glanced once more at the tree line, half expecting the tall shadow to appear again, but nothing stirred. The water beneath him was so clear that smooth stones gleamed below the thin layer of ice clinging to the edges. Still, it felt as though something unseen was moving in that cold flow, circling without ever breaking the surface. He forced himself toward the bank, pulling free from the creek with slow, clumsy step. His boots were soaked through, and his clothes clung to his skin. The snow underfoot felt harder now, the crunch sharper, as if the sound were too loud for such a still place. He reached the base of the pine and touched the strap of his pack. The fabric was stiff with cold, yet it was perfectly balanced across the branch. Not a single buckle or zipper was caught. Something deep in the woods made a sound, soft, low, and resonant, like a hum moving through the ground. It seemed to come from all directions at once. Nathan's pulse jumped, and a sharp ache spread across his chest. Without thinking, he grabbed his belongings and began moving quickly down the slope. The neat impressions in the snow reappeared ahead, wider and deeper than before, as if they had been set there moments earlier. They formed no path, just scattered shapes in a rough half-circle that closed in on the direction he needed to go. He stepped between them, each print large enough to swallow his boot. The air grew colder with every stride. His breath came in quick bursts, clouding the space in front of him. It felt as though the fog from his lungs lingered longer than it should, hanging in the air like it did not want to vanish. The creek's faint murmur faded behind him, replaced by the dry snap of something far off stepping on frozen branches. By the time Nathan reached a wider trail, the sound was gone. The forest opened just enough for faint daylight to reach the snow. The stillness followed him all the way back to where the land dropped toward the trailhead. When rescuers later found him sitting near the parking area, his clothes were stiff with frost, his gaze fixed on the slope above. He never explained what had happened beyond saying he had fallen into the water. Yet the careful arrangement of his belongings, the massive prints in the snow, and the strange hum in the air stayed unspoken but unforgettable for those who heard the details. In the weeks that followed, Nathan did not return to the mountains. The trail where he had been found remained empty, as though even the forest wanted no one to walk there again.